Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Beatrice and today I'm answering a request from a viewer from a few weeks ago to talk to you about Jane Austen and the Romantic movement. For those of you who may not know this, we use the term Romanticism or Romantic literature to talk about a number of writers who are all working roughly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and who, broadly speaking, emphasize emotion, self-expression, individualism, and an appreciation of the natural world and its beauties. Jane Austen is not often thought of as a romantic writer for a number of reasons. Firstly, often we tend to think of poetry rather than prose when we think of romantic literature. And as you may know, Austen mainly wrote novels, not poetry. And secondly, often Austen is thought to reject the outbursts of emotion that we commonly associate with romantic poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In this video, however, I want to make the case to you that Jane Austen was at least in conversation with these new literary trends that emerged in her lifetime, and that if not a fully fledged romantic writer, she was at least, let's say, a moderate romantic. Before I do anything else, I want to mention to you a book that is an excellent resource on this particular topic, and that is Jane Austen and the Romantic Poets by William Deresiewicz. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but in any case, I will link it below so you can see for yourself which book I am talking about. Now, luckily, some of this book, I think the introduction at least, is actually available on Google Books, so I will link it so you can have a look if you wish. Let me go through some of Deresiewicz's insights before I give you some of my own thoughts. Deresiewicz points out that we can be certain, or almost certain, that Jane Austen read several writers considered to be part of the Romantic movement. From Persuasion, as well as from some of her letters that we still have, we know that she was aware of Sir Walter Scott and of Lord Byron, as she mentioned works by both of them. William Wordsworth is mentioned in the unfinished novel Sanditon, and although Coleridge does not get a mention in any of her works or her letters, by the time Jane Austen started publishing her novels in 1811, his work would have been so well known along with Wordsworth's poetry, especially from the Lyrical Ballads, the collection of poetry that they published together in 1798, that she must have been at least aware of Coleridge as well as Wordsworth. As well as this, we know that Austen encountered and admired several poets from the later half of the 18th century whom are considered to be proto-romantic poets in the sense that they influence the later poets that I've mentioned. And some of these are poets like James Thomson, who wrote The Seasons, and William Cowper, both of whom are cited in Sense and Sensibility as being some of Marianne Dashwood's favourite poets. And we also know that Cowper was one of Austen's own favourite writers from her brother Henry Austen, who after her death remarked on her great love of Cowper. It was also her brother Henry, in the biographical notice attached to the posthumously published Northanger Abbey and Persuasion in 1818, right after Jane Austen's death. It was also her brother Henry then who tells us that Austen was enamoured of Gilpin on the picturesque. Now, what is Henry Austen referring to here when he says this? Well, the picturesque was an idea discussed by William Gilpin in his 1782 book, Observations on the River Wye. Gilpin described the aesthetic experience of visiting rural Wales and the reaction that provokes in us, the pleasure we take in nature. William Wordsworth himself was very familiar with Gilpin's work and went to the Wye Valley himself, and in particular visited Tintern Abbey, which inspired later his poem Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey from 1798. I actually visited Tintern Abbey myself last summer and filmed a little video where I show you what I got up to when I was there and where I read, actually my husband reads a section from Tintern Abbey. And here is where Deresiewicz gives us some very interesting points when he's discussing the connection between Gilpin and Wordsworth and Austen. In Mansfield Park, the narrator describes how in Fanny Price's room there are 3 transparencies, which are a type of painting, and these transparencies depict Tintern Abbey, a moonlight lake in Cumberland, and a cave in Italy. And this is definitely a reference to Gilpin, of course, the Tintern Abbey reference, who, as we have seen, mentions the Wye Valley and Tintern in his book that Jane Austen would have been familiar with. But by 1814, when Mansfield Park was published, actually the Wordsworth poem called Tintern Abbey would have probably been fresher in readers' imaginations, and Jane Austen would have most likely been aware of it. So it is possible that Austen here wants her readers, her contemporary readers, to think of Wordsworth even more than of Gilpin. And another possible reference to Wordsworth that Deresiewicz mentions is actually in Emma, which I hadn't thought of before, but I think he's got a point here. It is very convincing to me. The narrator describes how Mr. Knightley thinks he's catching a meaningful glance between Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, suspecting that they might be a couple, and if you've read Emma before, you know that he turns out to be right. So, at this point, Mr. Knightley is not sure that he is right, so right after thinking that they might be a couple, he wonders if he is mistaken. Like Cooper and his fire at twilight, myself creating what I saw. Here we have Mr. Knightley alluding to Cooper, who, as we know, Austen loved. But the same passage that is cited here is very similar to a passage in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. And I should note here that Wordsworth himself was a fan of Cooper and his poetry and was influenced by him. In Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth describes what his eye and ear half create and what perceive, meaning that he is not sure if his senses are picking up on something or whether it is actually his imagination projecting something onto what he is seeing. Like Wordsworth and like Cooper before him, Mr. Knightley is wondering how much of reality he is himself imagining, thus commenting on the power of our imagination, which is a very capital R romantic thing to do of Mr. Knightley. So these are some of the links and possible reference that Deresiewicz points out for us. And having done this, I would like to now give you some of my own intuitions and reflections on this. First of all, I should note that there is one aspect of romantic thought that I think does not necessarily mesh very well with Austen. That is the one that I'm most skeptical about. And that is the kind of revolutionary politics that some of the romantic poets supported. Several romantic writers were, at least for a time, because some of them changed their mind later, very much in favour of the French Revolution, which happened in 1789. So throughout the 1790s, they agreed with what happened in France and agreed with these revolutionary politics that, to some extent, were coming to England as well. I agree with Marilyn Butler's argument in her excellent and seminal book, Jane Austen and the War of Ideas, from the 1970s here, in saying that Jane Austen was very much not in line with these revolutionary politics. So there's that. But other than that, what about other characteristics that we associate with romantic literature, like love of nature, or what Wordsworth, in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, describes as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility? Well, in this aspect, when it comes to appreciation of the natural world and this idea of literature being about the overflow of feeling, I think, at the very least, Jane Austen is in conversation with these kinds of ideas. I also think that the key here is to remember that Austen, I think, at once appreciates genuine deep emotion and also has an abhorrence for false emotion, for simulated emotion or emotion that is unregulated and untempered by virtue. So let me give you some examples here. In Sense and Sensibility, Marianne can be seen as a very romantic character in the sense that she really appreciates poetry and nature and has very strong feelings. However, for most of the novel, her emotions are completely unregulated and unguarded. and she has nothing to anchor them or guide them at all. By the end of the novel, she is just as feeling. However, she has made atonement, she uses that particular word, she's made atonement to her family and to her God for abandoning herself to despair when Willoughby rejects her. And now she resolves to be in control of her emotions and to channel them through study and reading of poetry and through her relationships with her mother and sisters. Her newfound religious sensibilities then really help to anchor her. She's just as emotional, but now her emotions are more guided by her religious sensibilities. And another character whose religious fervour guides her powerful emotions is Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. Fanny is a very conscientious, very serious, very reserved young woman, and yet she also feels deeply, and she has a very romantic appreciation of the natural world. Perhaps my very favourite passage from the whole novel, which demonstrates this, is a scene in which Fanny is admiring the shrubbery in Mansfield Park, and she remarks as follows: "Every time I come into this shrubbery, I am more struck with its growth and beauty. 3 years ago, this was nothing but a rough hedgerow along the upper side of the field. And now it is converted into a walk, and it would be difficult to say whether most valuable as a convenience or an ornament. How wonderful, how very wonderful, the operations of time and the changes of the human mind." And following the latter train of thought, she soon afterwards added, "If any one faculty of our nature may be called more wonderful than the rest, I do think it is memory." This wonderful speech by Fanny, I think, really fits perfectly well with Wordsworth's idea of a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility. Fanny is reminiscing about the ways in which the shrubbery has changed, pondering on the beauty of the natural world and the wonders of the faculty of memory. She is indeed very Wordsworthian, I could say, like Marion herself, but unlike Marion, she also has a really strong moral compass from the beginning of the novel, which allows her to restrain her emotions when necessary. Finally, let me quickly remark on the role of romantic poetry in Persuasion, the last novel that Austen completed. The two main appreciators of romantic poetry in Austen's Persuasion are Anne Elliot, the heroine, and Captain Benwick. Benwick uses poetry as a way of wallowing in his grief over the death of his fiancée. Now, of course, it would be perfectly natural to wallow in grief when your fiancée has died, except for, not long after her death, he meets and quickly gets engaged to Louisa Musgrove, thus showing that his feelings, though expressed in a very theatrical way, are perhaps not as deep as he made them out to be. On the other hand, Anne is a true appreciator of poetry, and she's able to appreciate poetry without it becoming excessive because she can control her emotions. And at the same time, we also know that her emotions, unlike Captain Benwick's, are not fleeting but constant, because she remains faithful to Captain Wentworth throughout their separation of 8 years. So, having given you some of these examples, what I want you to take away from today's video is the idea that Jane Austen, I think, is romantic in a cautious way. She's a cautious romantic writer. I do think she shares some characteristics with romantic poets of her era, but at the same time, I think she remains very suspicious of displays of feeling, especially when they're very theatrical and very excessive displays of feelings, as Jane Austen recognized that these kinds of feelings could be deceitful or fleeting. I also think that Austen recognizes that feeling needs to be reined in by morals, especially in her case by the Christian faith. And that is what perhaps distinguishes her from some of the romantic poets of her time who were not necessarily particularly devout or committed to writing as Christians. And that could be the subject for a whole other video. And some of the romantic poets like Wordsworth later in life became very devout, but were not necessarily so earlier in life. So that is another aspect that we could go into, but that's something that we should really remember, that some of the romantic poets were not necessarily as religiously motivated as Jane Austen was. Now, Hopefully the topic for my next video will actually be to talk to you a little bit more about Jane Austen's changing religious sensibilities throughout her life, and in particular her associations with the evangelical movement and the Methodist movement in the early 19th century in England. There is lots there that's interesting and that links some of the dots with the romantic poets that I've mentioned to you, as some of the writers that romantic poets enjoyed reading were themselves involved with the evangelical movement at the time. They were abolitionists, they were very devout people, and there is a very interesting link there to explore, which I hope to talk to you more about in my next video. After that, I think I will take a little bit of a break from talking to you about Jane Austen until Jane Austen July, when of course I will make more Austen related content. So if you have any suggestions for what you would like to see in, I suppose, 2 videos from now for the coming months, please do leave your suggestions in the comments below. I will leave you here for today, and I hope to continue this conversation next time. So for now, have a wonderful weekend and see you next time. Bye.